welcome to today's webinar. My name is Moses Ondeche, and I'm the moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar is going to really focus on some of the things that we have continuously been talking about when it comes to transitioning care models and being able to ensure that we have as well tools that help us to transition. And so it is exciting for us to be here today because it is an ongoing conversation that we're having across the board. And so I will just start off by first saying that it's an honor to have a couple of panelists with us. We have with us Rebecca Knapp, who's a senior technical advisor at Better Care Network. We have with us Hannah Wan, who is also a technical advisor within Kindness in Myanmar. We also have Raika Tyagi, Director of Programs Design and Development, Miracle Foundation India, as well as Jacob Lears, Mission Pastor at Life Mission Church. And of course, with myself as well as a moderator and a panelist as a program management consultant, as a care solutions. Again, I'll just remind us to engage in the chat. We'd love to hear more about your thoughts. So keep the conversation going as we navigate through this webinar. I will also want to help us to know that within this time that we have, which is 1.5 hours, we will be going through the discussions, and then we will also take some time for Q&A at the end. And so we will start off by first, I just want to mention something that stood out to me as I was going through a couple of messages and information from one of our panelists, actually, who said that that as we get into this, as we have these conversations, I just want to remind us all to come in with open eyes, open hearts, and hopefully open hands. So as we start off, we just welcome us all to have open eyes, open hearts, and open minds. So Margaret, please, can we go to the next slide? So we will, as I've already mentioned, we can go to the next slide. And so as we talk about divestment and divestment guidelines, we'll start off by first introducing to us Rebecca Knapp. Rebecca Knapp is a senior technical advisor for the Better Care Network. She has 22 years of experience working in the international development and care reform sectors. Her focus is on transitioning residential care institutions and curtailing drivers of institutionalization, including orphanage, tourism, and foreign funding. Rebecca is also the co-founder and co-chair of Rethink Orphanages Australia and co-convener of the Australian Council for International Development's Child Rights Community of Practice. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Moses, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. We're very excited to have you all here, and we're very excited to be able to share with you a range of tools today that have all been co-developed by the Transitioning Residential Care Working Group, and it's been part of our work plan and agenda for 2024. So it's very excited today to be able to launch some of these and share some of these resources with you. So I'm going to very briefly go through one of the two primary resources that we are launching today, and that is the Divestment of Residential Care Services Guideline. So these guidelines have been developed for donors and partners of residential care services, and they are designed to outline a clear step-by-step process that helps donors develop an ethical and a safe divestment plan. Now, it's important to be clear when we say donors who we're talking about. So it's not for all donors, but it's specifically for donors who have a direct relationship with or a partnership with a residential care service and who donate to a reasonably significant level. So we're sort of differentiating between that type of donor or partner and, for example, a child sponsor who may give a much smaller amount, even though they give that regularly, but most likely giving through an intermediary organization. So it may not be as relevant to that type of donor, but it is relevant to the intermediary organization, for example, that they give to, that they and then collects and sends that funding onwards. Next slide, please, Margot. So the guidelines were developed in response to feedback from donors and partners themselves, but also in response to practitioners who are part of the Transitioning Residential Care Working Group who work directly with donors and partners, a lot of them overseas from the countries where the services are. And what we were hearing from them is that it's really challenging and confronting for donors to determine when it's time to divest, how to divest in a way that's ethical and safe and still upholds the best interests of the children in the residential facility, and what exactly is their role and the limits of their role in a divestment process, noting that they are a donor or a partner versus the technical organization on the ground. So in the absence of a clear and consensus-based framework for making those decisions, we were hearing that many donors and partners were finding it challenging to determine, to make a decision as to when they should move forward with divestment, even though they were reasonably sure that continuing to fund the residential care service was not necessarily the right course of action. And so these guidelines are designed to walk donors through that process of making ethical decisions, considering their context and the unique situation of their partnership, and then pulling that information together into a divestment plan that they can then systematically implement. Next slide, please, Margot. Now, these guidelines, importantly, they link to the phases of transition interactive diagram. And unfortunately, that image on the screen is not super clear, but hopefully most of you are already familiar with the phases of transition diagram. And this fits within that diagram, as you can see there in that slide, and in the next slide we'll show in just a moment. In the implementation, which is phase 3, there are 2 pathways. Pathway A is a full transition to other types of non-residential services, and pathway B is the pathway for safe closure or divestment. And so these guidelines really flesh out that divestment pathway, as the phases of transition diagram as it stands doesn't actually have a lot of detail in there about developing a divestment plan. So these guidelines are designed to sort of plug in to the phases tool at that phase and provide the guidance and the framework for developing that implementation plan for the divestment pathway. So it kind of includes a checklist. It links in one other way, in that it includes a checklist at the very beginning of the guidelines that contains some key actions and indicators that link right back to phase 1 of the phases of transition diagram. And they help the donor partner really just check, have I actually gone through all of the different actions and attempted to the best of our ability to encourage our partner to first and foremost transition? And it really helps them to understand, have we done everything possible to encourage transition, to communicate support for transition, to make linkages between our partner and other organizations or support to make transition more practical and feasible for them. So it helps them work through that and say, yes, I've done everything that we can do to encourage transition, but we've still not been able to secure agreement for whatever reason from our partner. And so now it is time to move into that divestment role. And the guidelines then also help them understand what their role within that divestment process is and how to engage with in-country child protection and technical support organizations who can come alongside and in particular just really help to make sure that divestment process is safe, There's somebody monitoring the outcomes for children. There's somebody monitoring to see whether or not that service may start to reintegrate or exit children in response to divestment. So it encourages them to play their role as the donor partner, but to link with a technical organisation in country in order to safeguard children throughout the process. Next slide, please, Margot. So in terms of what the guidelines actually, oh, sorry, go to the next one. I forgot to show you the close-up of the safe closure pathway there, but we'll go to the next slide, please. In terms of what the guidelines actually have, there are 9 distinct steps within this guidelines that donors and partners can walk through, and each of them guide you to develop a component of the divestment plan that is brought together in step number 9 into an overarching implementation plan for divestment. So the first step there, donors are guided to identify their donor profile, whether or not they are a sole donor, the only donor providing all of the financial support, whether or not they are a principal donor, meaning they are one of the largest donors, or whether or not they are a general donor, one of many or a handful of donors who are funding that service. And this profile influences how much notice they need to give before divesting, the approach to progressively scaling back their funding and support of that service. So that's what they work through in step 1. In step 2, donors are guided to develop a plan to secure buy-in from decision makers within their own organizational structure. So if they represent a charity or a church or another entity where there are other people who need to be involved, it helps them develop that plan to share information and to secure a clear agreement to divest, so that that implementation plan is more secure and implementation isn't disrupted in any way by a lack of agreement at the beginning. In step 3, donors are guided to identify the level of risk, which guides decisions about how they may need to report, provide information, whether that's to government agencies or in-country child protection organisations, to make sure that children are safe and that any concerns that have been identified or noted are acted upon by the appropriate agencies in country to protect those children. In step 4, donors are guided to reach out to in-country child protection organisations to discuss the safeguarding issues that they may have identified in step 3, and to also explore their reinvestment options. So to look at what other organisations are in that country that may be implementing around family-based care, community services, prevention of separation, disability-specific services. So understanding what the options are so that they can consider not only how they divest, but where they reinvest that money, so that we are not actually losing money from the child protection sector, but we're really supporting donors to go through that process of reinvesting in community and family services. In the next step, which is step 5, it is about guiding donors to how to reach out to their other donor partners, to understand are there other donors that are funding the same service, and exploring the possibility of being able to work collectively, either to revisit transition and see whether or not, with more donors on board, would that provide the level of support and encouragement to the residential care service to reconsider transition, or if not, to consider a coordinated approach to divestment. And so they reach out to other donors if possible, and once they have that information, then they can start to consider their divestment timeline and their scaling back strategy, including whatever decreases that they may make over time and what that time frame might be. In step 6, donors are guided to consider how they're going to reinvest. So they gathered a bunch of information in a preceding step about what the options are in that country. And in this next step, they consider where they're going to reinvest and whether that means they need to develop new partnerships, expand existing partnerships, conduct additional due diligence around those partnerships so that they can move forward with the reinvestment with a secure partnership framework in place. In the next step, which is step 7, donors are guided to develop a stakeholder communications plan for all of the non-decision-making stakeholders affected by the divestment. and then to implement that communications plan in a latter step. So that takes into account, individual donors, child sponsors, it might be church constituents if this is playing out in a church environment. In step 8, donors are guided to inform their residential care service partner of their intention to divest and of the time frame when that's going to commence and when they intend to conclude that divestment process. And that really kickstarts the formal implementation of the divestment planning. And then in step 9, donors are guided to collate all the information that they've gathered throughout those various steps and components, integrate it into a project management tool, whether that's something they already use in their organization, or the guidelines provide some recommendations if they don't, so that they have an overarching framework that they can use to coordinate implementation. And it also encourages them in that step to look at any policy changes they may need to make within their organization, so that divestment decision isn't only about that specific partnership, but it actually becomes a position of the organization to fund family-based care and community services and to not continue to support and fund residential services. Now, these divestment guidelines are very practical. There's tables, there's interactive components that the users can engage with to help them bring that information together, consider it, and turn it into their divestment plan. And it's also supported by a case study that gives concrete examples of next steps from very experienced donors who've already completed that divestment journey. So that's a very quick overview, but with us today, we also have our first panelist who I'd like to welcome now, Jacob Lears. And Jacob is very briefly going to speak about his experience of divesting of residential care services overseas. And as you'll learn from Jacob, he has experience in a number of settings. It's not just one partnership that they had in place. But by way of introduction, Jacob and his wife Teresa and their 5 children spent 9 years with YWAM, Youth with a Mission, with a pioneering in the Horn of Africa. And while they were there, they also served as a convener for the African Eldership Circle. And Jacob now leads global mission and local outreach at Life Mission Church and consults and coaches other churches in their network, helping them discover their unique role in God's mission. And Jacob is very passionate about seeing God do new things in new ways and in new places. And he's joining us today to share about his experience of implementing that very philosophy within his own work of really pivoting away from funding residential care services and going through that challenging divestment process. So welcome, Jacob. Thank you so much for joining us today. And just by way of giving people a little bit of insight into where you're coming from, the first question I'd like to ask you is, where did your church have partnerships with residential care services and why did you divest?
Yes, we're kind of in train. We have both. We have divested in some. We are in the process of divesting, and we have some on the horizon as well. But overall, we had Haiti, which was the first one. We walked alongside them through transition and divestment. Indonesia is one we divested from. And then India, we have 2 group homes there, one in Uganda and one in Mozambique. And the why started in Haiti. We had a partnership there. It sent several teams, lots of money, and people loved it. They loved the trips. We always heard good things. And then we sent someone down to live and serve on staff full time. And over the course of some months, we started to see signs of corruption. And then the big punch to the gut, though, was we discovered there was rampant abuse towards the children. And we were devastated to find that out. And it really started us on this journey where I think initially we were thinking reform and accountability and how do we put those things. But as we did the research, we just and prayed into it. We felt like the Lord was leading us. And the research showed that we didn't want to be involved in group homes anymore. And so we started that process first there in Haiti. And again, we're able to transition those kids back into their families of origin. And then slowly divested, and that organization that ran that group home is closed just this year.
Wow, excellent. So it's a very diverse experience and challenging, and it's unfortunately not unique to your situation that divestment can be triggered by discovering some pretty challenging things that may have been going on within those facilities. So Another quick question before we get to the main question that we really want you to dig into, how you see these guidelines as being relevant, both having the benefit of hindsight, but also being midway through the process. But in your experience so far, what have you found the most difficult about the divestment process?
Yeah, I would say, again, we had a strong conviction, like as we leaned into the Lord, it was this, that God wants kids and families, and he doesn't want them in institutions, and he wants the best possible option for every kid, and that's what we want for our kids, and that's what we want for kids across the world. So we have a very strong conviction, but then to balance that tension of compassion and not wanting to be that cartoon character that's like, oh, I'm going to shut down all the orphanages, but doing
Yeah.
it in a loving way. And not even trying to feel like we're manipulating people to do things the way that we want to do, but how we communicate it to them, how we answer, even if we can get them to buy into the why, the how. And so and again, every situation is different. One of our other homes, we've recently discovered abuse as well. And so we're moving quicker on that one. But and then we have stronger relationships, even with the directors and staffs at some, just from trips and things. So there's, that conviction versus compassion tension.
Yeah, and it's a hard tension to hold, and it can be very complicated, can't it, when you're trying to work out how do you navigate this, how do you implement it, and particularly at the time that you began doing this, we didn't have the benefit of, any materials or guidance that had been put together. So now having both that benefit of hindsight and experience, but now having had the opportunity to see the guidelines that have recently been developed by the working group, how do you think that they might influence the approach you take with the remaining divestment processes and projects that you have that you're continuing to work through? Or what components of the guidelines do you feel are particularly helpful for you?
Yeah, the systematic nature of it, the holistic nature of it. When I saw him, a little embarrassed because the way we had done things was just from the hip, and we probably stumbled into most of it. But they say clear is kind, and I don't think we were always very clear in what the process was or what our thinking was. And we were just doing our best, kind of fumbling through the dark and one step at a time. But to be able to look at the holistic process and be able to communicate that clearly from the beginning, I think will be a service and provide that compassion that we want to have for these ministries we partnered with for years or decades.
Thank you. That is so helpful. And we've heard that from a few other donor organizations or partner organizations as well, that just like you, they've reflected on the guidelines and said, oh, actually, even though they weren't drafted at the time, we did almost everything in there, maybe not in the same order, but we did almost everything. But even looking at it in hindsight has provided this assurance of, oh, okay, we weren't completely on the wrong track. And I think that's one of the things we're really hoping with these guidelines is not only to provide that clarity, but to give donors confidence in moving forward. So that's it's really helpful to hear from you that has done that for you. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to hand back to Moses for the second part of our presentations. If you have more questions for Jacob, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A, and you will have time to ask those questions or for us to pose those questions at the end. Over to you, Moses. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Jacob. That was an incredibly informative conversation. And as we kind of shift gears to another interesting or equally interesting aspect of transition and what we're doing, I'll just want to welcome our next panelist, Hannah Wan. Hannah Wan is the technical advisor for Connect Myanmar and has 22 years of experience working with vulnerable children and their families in Southeast East Asia and the United States. Her focus is on providing technical support, so sharing learnings and developing resources on the transition of residential care services. Anna holds a Master's of Science in Education with a specialization in early childhood. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you, Moses. And I just have to briefly say before I go into my presentation that, Jacob, what you said about the feeling of stumbling through the dark and just trying to do our best, but not knowing if we're really doing it, pretty much how I felt when I was going through the transition of our own orphanage. So I would say that maybe there are others in the audience who can feel that they resonate with that. So thank you for sharing that. That was great to hear that experience. So Margot, if you can go to the first slide, please, and the next one after that. So the purpose of this transition monitoring tool is to help users monitor the progress of a residential care service transition and to identify when there might be obstacles or potential resistance to transition that may be hindering progress. The tool is designed to guide the implementation of a transition strategy, and it allows users to set time-bound goals for the various stages and activities of the transition. It then prompts users to monitor progress against those goals and to adapt the transition strategy as often as necessary to ensure that transition is feasible and remains the safest option for children. Next slide, please, Margot. The tool was developed primarily for practitioners providing technical support to private residential care service providers and their principal or main donors as they work through a transition process. So as background, we refer to directors and principal donors as the key stakeholders throughout this tool, and you'll hear me use this term throughout the presentation. So this tool can also be used more broadly as a work plan to guide technical support organizations through transition activities, even if they're not using the scoring component, or even residential care directors and or donors who are independently undergoing transition without the support of a third-party agency. The tool was designed for the context of full transition, planned closure, or divestment of privately run and funded residential care services. And although it can be used in the voluntary transition of government-run residential care services, the tool is not designed for government-mandated or forced closures triggered by child protection risks. And the tool goes into that in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please, Margot. So the tool is part of the Transition Framework tools, which can be accessed in the BCN Practitioner Hub. And I believe Margot will drop a link to that resource later on in the chat box. And that framework includes the interagency tools developed by the Transition Working Group that's hosting the webinar tonight. Next slide, please, Margot. The monitoring tool integrates the content from the phases of transition interactive diagram that Rebecca just went through earlier. It prompts users to establish their own goals by selecting and completing the activities across these 3 phases of transition that you see in this diagram. And it prompts users to do that with the activities that are the most relevant for their own transition. Those goals that they set themselves then become the baseline against which they can track progress over regular reporting periods. Next slide, please. The tool was designed to support reporting, and it can be used to provide regular updates on transition progress to key stakeholders, including keeping donors who are funding the transition informed and engaged. It can be used to trigger discussions with them as well when transition progress is slow or has stalled. And then it can be used to inform project management reports for the organization supporting or implementing the transition. And it can be used as the basis for developing a monitoring framework for transition. Next slide, please, Margot. So one of the primary functions of this tool is the scoring mechanism, which has been designed to quantify transition progress where possible and to help users identify when there might be resistance to transition. So one of the biggest challenges we often hear from colleagues that are working in this space is that there is often no definition or baseline for what constitutes progress, or how to get different stakeholders to agree on whether transition is going well, whether it's not going well, whether it's going too quickly or too slowly, those kinds of things. And the video tutorial that we're going to play next will broadly introduce the scoring mechanism, but we do also have hyperlinks included within the tool where you can access more detailed tutorials as you work through it. So Margot, if you could please play the video. In the first tab of the transition monitoring tool, here is where you can enter information about your transition, including the starting month and year for each of the phases as you work through the transition. Here, you can choose between pathway A for full transition or pathway B if closure or divestment is more realistic. Down here, you can see an index of all of the tabs that are contained within this tool. Here, you can see that the pathway you selected up here is reflected down here, and the areas that are not relevant to your pathway are blacked out to indicate that they do not need to be completed. The same goes for the closure option under pathway B and pathway A for full transition. So in this scenario, because we have selected pathway A for full transition, pathway B is blacked out, as is the corresponding tab for phase 3, pathway B. Down here, we have the scoring key that relates to the phase 3 social work processes, which we will come back to later. Here you can see the stages for phase 1 that have been integrated from the phases of transition diagram. This month relates to the starting month you entered for phase 1 in the first tab, and these months are your reporting periods. You can change the frequency here, and these become your new reporting periods. You can then start going through the suggested activities under each stage of phase 1. For the activities that are appropriate for your transition, you can select from the drop-down menu using this legend up here. If the activity is not relevant to your transition, you can select NA. As you work through your transition, you can keep selecting from this drop-down menu for each of the reporting periods. If there are any activities that have not been captured in this checklist, you can add them here. Down here, you will see a tally of all the drop-down selections you made across the phase 1 activities. The number of completed activities divided by the total number of activities in phase 1 gives you a percentage for this reporting period. And as you continue through the transition, you can monitor how that percentage changes. That gives you a sense of progress for phase 1, and it can indicate where there might be an obstacle, resulting in stalled progress or even regression. Down here, you'll see the transition milestones from the phases diagram for phase 1, and you can also add in your own milestones. The tabs for phase 2 and the organizational change processes for phases 3A and 3B all use the same format and scoring as phase 1. Again, you can select from the drop-down menus here. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you can see the percentages indicating transition progress for this phase. Now, this is where we start to see the color-coded system we mentioned before for the social work processes. The tutorial here explains the reason for the system, as well as the logic behind the scoring. The format is the same as the previous tabs, but here at the bottom, you'll see that progress is captured not only as a raw percentage, but it also tracks how your progress relates to other reporting periods. So here, if we start out at 14%, and that increases to 18% of activities that have been completed, that shows as green. When the percentages stay the same, it shows as yellow. When it decreases, it shows as orange, and red when it repeatedly decreases. The scoring key in the first tab provides a possible interpretation of these color ratings. Green indicates that everything is on track. The key stakeholders, that is the directors and donors of the residential care service, are likely on board with transition, and you can continue with your implementation plan. Yellow is a signal to just keep an eye on things because progress is slightly behind the goals that were set, but there may be an explanation that does not necessarily indicate resistance to transition from the key stakeholders. And here, it suggests some basic recommended actions. Orange indicates that you may need to be careful and to pay pretty close attention to what's happening. If you've only been reporting at quarterly intervals or every 3 months, this might be when you decide to increase the frequency of your reporting periods to make sure you're catching things quickly if transition is not progressing. Orange can indicate where there might be resistance to transition that has not been identified or adequately addressed. And finally, we have red, where there is little to no progress, and you may need to reevaluate whether transition is feasible or safe. In this tab is where we see the final type of scoring system. Here, users should be working with the social work team to estimate the number of children and young people who are expected to receive case management services during any reporting period. So if you look at the first activity here, which is children participating in trust-building exercises with social workers, let's say there are 30 children in the residential care service. You might estimate that it's feasible for social workers to be meeting with all the children within the first 6 months. So in this row, you can fill in your goals. Gradually increasing over the reporting periods until you reach 30 children within the first 6 months. You can always change these goals at any time, depending on whether they're realistic or not. You can go through the rest of the activities and set your goals together with the social work team. It's also important to review these goals with the key stakeholders so that everyone can be reminded of what the reintegration process entails and be clear on what is expected of them. The tutorial for this tab goes into this in more detail. After you've filled out your goals for the other activities, you can then start reporting on the actual number of children receiving each case management service. So let's say social workers were able to start trust building exercises with 3 children in the first month then 7, and 8, and so on. The data for all the case management activities are then tallied here, where you get a total score of how many children received the various case management services during each reporting period, divided by the goals that you set together with the social workers. So rather than giving you a percentage of activities that have been completed, as in the other tabs, instead you can see a percentage of the number of children who are receiving case management services in preparation for reintegration. These colors correspond to the same scoring key in the first tab that interprets what these scores may mean for your transition progress and whether your strategy may need to be adapted. And it's the same format for case management services for families down here. This tab returns to the format and scoring of the tabs for phases 1 and 2. It serves more as a quality control check for case management. For example, ensuring that young people are participating in their own care planning, that you're engaging with the appropriate authorities if there are any child protection issues, that sort of thing. It returns to the drop-down menu format and gives you a raw percentage of completed activities here. Finally, we have the reporting summary tab, where all of the total percentages calculated in each of the tabs in the tool are pulled together in one place so you can see at a glance what progress looks like across the entire transition. Here you can see phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 under pathway A for full transition, with pathway B blacked out. In the social work processes for phase 3, you can see the color-coded system here that can be interpreted using the scoring key in the first tab. You can use this data to produce reports for the purposes we discussed in the introduction, and you can refer to it as an evidence base to demonstrate when transition may not be progressing. Down here, we've provided some space for users to conduct a bit of a sense check to gauge whether the scoring accurately reflects what you're seeing in reality. And you can provide explanations for the scoring in any of the reporting periods as needed. Thank you, Margot. Can we go to the last slide, please? And as we wait for that to pop up, in closing, I'd just like to highlight that there are significant restrictions to the automated scoring system. And so we have tried to design areas that address that, but it's also important to remember that this is only one tool out of many that practitioners can use. And we do expect users to, of course, rely on their own experience and their knowledge and also their intuition to interpret the situations and the scoring that they're seeing. And now that the tool is available, we'd love to hear your feedback as you start to use it in real time. And we hope to be able to continue to improve the tool in a future iteration. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Moses, our wonderful moderator, who's now going to put on his practitioner hat and share with us his perspectives on the transition monitoring tool. Moses is one of the members of the transition working group who has been involved in the development of this tool from the very beginning. It was almost a year ago now, Moses. So he is perfectly placed to share his insights with us today. So Moses, thank you so much for agreeing to be on our panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna, for the welcome. I am continuously excited and amazed to see how we're, as a community, are continuously building resources to support transition And as we were having a conversation earlier with Rebecca, just being able to, Rebecca and Jacob talking about the divestment and how it kind of links to this. I see a lot of experiences within care reform, within practitioners who are passionate about seeing children within families and home, that there's a continuous desire to have practical tools that help them to identify how they can best support organizations, directors within these organizations to kind of shift their mindset and to embrace the journey from institutional care to family and community-based care. And it was very interesting to kind of hear, as Jacob was talking about earlier, about how how do we identify some of the big challenges that are coming up within institutions like corruption and abuse that directly affect how children are cared for. How do we best mitigate those issues and challenges with the end goal of ensuring that children are within safe, loving, and sustainable family and community? And I kind of see that continue even with this tool. My experience working with transition tools has been that the more we build tools like this, and as we identify within transition, what are the aspects of an organization that make them uniquely prepared to transition? One of them, as we are going through this specific tool, when it comes to identifying the challenges within an organization, what are the usefulness of this tool and how can it best help identify resistance, is that there are aspects of an organization like in phase one when they're talking, when they're having a discussion around what are the aspects that they need to prepare for, what are the things they need to be doing within the organization, like are they part of a network, a child protection network? Are they networking with other organizations that are not only within child protection, but are also focusing on the organizational transition? How are they engaged? Because that shows some kind of, you know, acceptance and also embracing of the journey. And so those are areas that can show if there is interest within the organization and the leadership to transition, and that if they do not necessarily meet some of this, criteria, then they're not necessarily as embracing the whole process and not necessarily prepared to transition. And so I see this tool becoming more and more relevant to practitioners in the field. Again, as you look at it, of course, some of us will say it is a bit clunky in terms of it has a lot of information, but that's why we're here to kind of work together to look at this tool and use it and practically test it out and see what are the areas that work within the context of a country, within the context of an organization that is supporting institutions to transition, to be able to see what is the usefulness of this tool. And I find that it gives the platform a foundation to understand and go through the evaluation of an organization who is either struggling or at the same time is not embracing transition. How do we help the donors and directors to be informed on what is happening within the institution, and how best do we not only report and inform, but also how do we best support organizations to transition? And I see there's, we talk about the aspect of reporting, and we talk about being able to track progress. And I see this tool having um, a lot of goodies, for lack of a better word, that help to be able to track the progress of an organization that is either willing to transition or not necessarily willing to transition. And that gives the information to, donors on what to do. But it also gives practitioners who are supporting organizations transition to be able to know what are the aspects that are very unique to an organization being able to transition. So yeah, there is the tracking of the progress. There is the work plans that they build with the institution. This becomes their way of being able to build a very specific, very directed work plan that includes the process of transition for an organization, but also specifically what are the areas that they need to work on. And also for social workers, it's probably going to be informative to them, just from the aspect of knowing what are the best practices when it comes to transition, because it's very detailed in itself, the tool, when it comes to understanding what are the areas that they need to work on, what are the areas I need to be able to be informed about as a practitioner, because then as we are informing and reporting and sharing information about being able, as we track and assess, we should also be able to provide solutions. And I think that is the other thing that I see this tool kind of directing us towards, is continuously building solutions that are informed by the specific areas in this tool, but also informing the specific experiences that are within a context. A good example is within Kenya. We have organizations that want to transition, but have not necessarily had the tools to be able to know how to do it. And so this becomes a guide to help them to start identifying the areas that they probably don't have information about, but also helping practitioners to know what are some of the solutions that we need to kind of work together. And again, the collaborative aspect of this is very important. Are we continuously within this platform and others coming together to say, hey, we have this tool right now that helps us to track the progress and gauge whether a transition is, a transition strategy is appropriate. Are we able to work together to kind of improve and grow these tools to become very relevant to our experiences? So I think this tool helps us to effectively track, but also assess the essential components of a successful transition. Yeah. Over to you, Anna.
So I think now we'll hand it over to Richa so that Richa can also share her perspective as a potential user. And Richa did kindly go through the tool and retrospectively fill it out with her colleagues at Miracle Foundation India. So we'd love to hear from you, Richa, on your perspectives on the transition, the monitoring tool. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Moses. So Miracle Foundation has been working over 24 years with its commitment towards its vision of a family for every child in our lifetime. And the two pillars, which are really the pillars of our work, are really about transitioning children from institution to families and creating mechanisms in families and communities to keep children safe, and really strengthening families of children to ensure a long-term well-being. And we really collaborate with the child protection system and allied systems and strategic partners to be taking that forward. As a learning organization, we have always stayed with this notion that child-first approach is very important. And I would say that Miracle Foundation was one of the early adopters of this approach, where we took on to inspire and technically facilitate our partner organizations to take on this path of transforming care. And we leveraged the tri-scale methodology to look at data-driven decisions in transition and family strengthening. And when we embarked on this journey of transforming care, way back in 2016, and we had our learnings and lessons learned as we moved on this path and looked at transforming care with initially when we piloted with two of our partners in the state of Tamil Nadu and Madhya Pradesh. And rest is history, as you know, we were delighted to then share our learnings and contribute our learnings, experiences, our documentation with Better Care Network when the residential care services transition framework tools were getting developed, which I'm so glad to see that this is such a wonderful resource in the sector. Sorry, I'm just interrupting. There is some noise in the background. Yeah, sorry. So so that was, a time where I was mentioning that the transition framework tools are really a wonderful resource in the sector to refer to when it comes to transitioning residential services. And as part of this working group, Miracle Foundation India has had a tremendous opportunity to learn as well as to contribute. As we are in this process of also taking our experiential learning from the ground to then theorize and create our own framework on transition and develop a curriculum around it, we certainly refer to the tremendous research and these tools which are available from BCN. And we got an opportunity to engage with the transition monitoring tool, and we tested this in retrospect with one or two of our CCI partners. And I would want to highlight some of the key things. And one of the things I would say, as I reflect back also, thinking retrospectively of our experience of transition and transforming care, and the testing that we did on this tool, one of the things I would say at the outset is that tools like this, it actually plays down, it actually makes it very clear to all the stakeholders as to what is the agreement we are getting into. It gives us a clarity that on one hand is the intention that we really believe in transitioning residential care service, and which is in the best interest of the child, and really transforming these services to be made available for the community. But at the same time, there is a mechanism to it, and there is a process to it, and there is a discipline to it, which needs to be followed. So there is an agreement at the outset. We are clear about the intention and the mechanics of it. And by the same note, it actually helps us to monitor the progress well and track it. And I think also down the line, it's very, when we are talking about monitoring, at times what happens is that although the intention is there, but the process is falling behind. So I think that is why the tool, referring to the tracking tool, helps us to have those discussions objectively and reflect on those. So really helping us move in that direction where we are upholding the intention, but we are also taking measures to be following the process. So that's a very important point there. Also, I think the donor reporting aspect of it serves to be a very important support for the residential care facility itself, because I think that's one of the most prominent challenges that comes to the table, because where the organization faces that challenge of how do I really build a case with my donor and with my funder. So this is where the tracking tool provides a very structured, systematic data point and a very transparent, evidence base to the donors for them to understand that it is not just lip service, or it is not just that somebody is saying it, but there is a proof to it. So that's an important part. The other thing which I wanted to mention is that, as we get into the phase 1, which is about learning and exploration, and then phase 2 is getting into the preparation. phase 3 is really the heart of the tool, because, it is really getting into the case management process. It is getting into family tracing, and the social worker is engaging now and looking at the assessment and the planning and the follow-up. So that is where while we are tracking the progress, I think as an organization, and all the key stakeholders who are involved, it gives us a very good base to reflect. Because ultimately, it's very good base to reflect on every case scenario and every situation, and in terms of how is it, helping the child, how are we moving in that direction? At the same time, taking both the micro and the macro picture. So where we are looking at the transition of the child, at the same time, we are also delving into and constantly upholding the vision that we've had from the beginning of how, as an organization, how as a facility, I'm going to transform as a service provider. So what are the measures that we are taking? And that's why, the phase 1 and phase 2 are really those reference points for the senior management or the child, the CFOs of the organization. So I think that is, overall, I would say it really helps all the stakeholders, be it the technical service providers or be it the residential care service themselves and their staff, the multidisciplinary teams, to reflect very objectively on every aspect, so that everybody is moving in the right direction and not getting held up, getting lost on the way, or getting entangled on some points. So yeah, these are some of the insights at the outset, which I wanted to share. It has been wonderful journey being part of the transitioning residential care services working group for Miracle. We've been part of the working group for quite some time, and it is wonderful to see the collaboration which the working group as part of the Transforming Child Care Collective has brought together. And we would want to continue to learn as well as contribute to our best to this movement, where we all believe in the transitioning of children, in children growing up in families, and in their best interests. So thank you so much. Over to you, Hannah.
Thank you so much for that, Richa. I'm going to actually pass to Moses for the Q&A section next.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you so much, Rika, for that very informative, very detailed, sharing of your experiences and how this can be very, very beneficial. I think conversations around collaborating and continuously working together needs to happen as we move forward. I will quickly take us to the next session. As Anna has just mentioned, we're going into a Q&A. And here we're just going to go through some of the questions that have come up through the conversations that we've had so far. And that way we can be able to quickly get some answers from our panelists. I will start with the first question, and this one goes to Jacob. The question is there risk of people perceiving divestment as punishment driven by corruption allegations?
I'm assuming this question means when there's not actual corruption and we don't want to give a false impression. So that's how I'm going to answer it. But again, it comes to clear communication, and I think pointing at the process. One thing we're always clear to communicate is, again, we're not looking for reform. We're not trying to build up good group homes or orphanages. We really are divesting in the system. And we're coming against the system, and it's not good versus bad, corrupt versus not corrupt, abuse or not abuse. Even though that's what triggered us initially, it moved us in a direction where we've decided, again, as a church, that the Lord's leading us, as Richa said, like that kids belong in families. And they belong in true homes, and not just the change in the vernacular to make it something different, but not in institutions, but in loving homes with loving families.
Awesome, awesome. That is really good. I think there's also the continuous empathy that is, you know, required as you do that, to not only, you know, there's empathy with those who are going through the experiences, like the children and some of the organization members who don't necessarily are part of all that's going on, but also there's empathy for those who you work with as a person who is giving and supporting these organizations. How much do they need to know, and how much what are the experiences, feelings they have through that process? So I thank you for that. That's really good. We have another question, and this is what languages are these resources available in? I think that's a question that's come up, and I don't know if Rebecca, you want to answer that question.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So at this point in time, the monitoring tool that Hannah introduced is available in English and Spanish. The Spanish version will be posted on the website in probably a week's time. It's just finished translation and we'll now go through the final checks, and that'll be posted, and we'll put a note in the working group as well as share it on social media and so forth when that's released. The divestment guidelines are currently only in English, but there is an explanatory note in Spanish available so that Spanish practitioners who intend to share that resource with donors who are English-speaking donors of residential care services in the Latin American region can understand what the divestment guidelines do, how they work, how they can be used, to encourage them to be able to share that with any donors or partners they may be engaging with. We are, in general, trying to make these resources more and more available in other languages. If that's something that you're interested in supporting, if you're working in a country where you would like to see this available in another language, we very much welcome you to reach out and we can have that conversation, and that might be something you might be able to support in order to make it more accessible, excuse me, to your practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. The next question is going to go back to you again. And the question is, how can we ensure operational continuity of the center during the divestment process?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I would be hazarding a guess that, Jacob, this may have gone through some of your conversations when you were divesting, is that tension of saying, okay, the residential care facility is not transitioning. That's what divestment means. We're now going through a process of withdrawing the funding. How does this work? What will happen? Will they have enough money to continue running? Will the children be affected negatively? Will they have enough food? Will their care be compromised? So one of the things that the divestment guidelines does is encourage donors to consider a staged approach. So there's a number of timelines that it recommends. One is how long between giving notice of your intention to divest and when you commence with actually withdrawing the funding, so that they have time to consider their options. They have time to look at how they're going to manage that. It also gives them time, for some cases, a facility may in that period of time actually really deeply consider transition and come back and then engage with transition instead of divestment. The second thing is that if you do progress with divestment, it then encourages you to do that by decreasing in stages versus just withdrawing your funding. And so again, that is really offsetting that risk of a serious disruption, but still managing the overarching goal of redirecting that funding towards family care services. It's a real tension because we don't want to perpetuate institutional care for children, but we also don't want to harm children who are currently in these services. So that's the way the divestment guidelines approaches it. And by profiling what type of donor the donor is, are they the sole donor, the principal, that also helps them gauge how long those timeframes need to be for that very reason. Thank you.
Thank Thank you, Rebecca. I think there's also the continuous need for, or rather what I'm seeing pop up in like in Kenya is organizations that want to completely change and become support services for transition. And it's like, how do we help these organizations that the divestment is happening within the institution? How do we help to kind of navigate and collaborate with other organizations that are supporting the transition process for children to be able to start doing that even as divestment is taking place, and kind of channel those, that kind of investment into transitioning children, or rather reintegrating children back into family. So I thank you for that. We're going to go to the next question, and this is to you, Anna. The question is, I was looking at the phases of transition and looking at, there are only 3 phases, and we're talking about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And, it's been singled out as, the learning and engagement, preparing for transition, and finally implementing it in phase 3. What about the other critical phases, such as monitoring and post-placement support? As this individual feels like the 2 steps are critical in ensuring that the transition is viable and children remain within the structures where they have been transitioned to. So to you, Anna.
Thank you. And thank you for that question. It actually echoes some of the feedback we've had on this tool, which is there is a bit of kind of a jar when you look at this tool without kind of understanding where it comes from, which is that it's very closely linked to the phases of transition diagram. And so that phases of transition diagram we briefly covered earlier, and I've just shared my screen to show you this, is that these are the phases that we refer to, but under phase 3, we've actually got 2 different levels of procedures that are going on. So we've got the organizational change processes that are happening for things that are happening at that level. But then we've also got the purple phases here that are specific to the social work processes. And so in this introductory video, we don't really go into the details of that. But if you actually look down here, all of the purple phases here are devoted to the social work processes. And as Richa was saying in her presentation, actually, these are the areas that form the heart of the tool. It really is about the social work process. And that is because that is when we tend to see the most interference, when there is resistance from one of the key stakeholders. And that's why we've designed the tool around those social work activities. So if you cross over here to those purple tabs, the question particularly was asking about post-placement monitoring. And so if you go to the monitoring tabs, you'll actually see that these case management activities are all centered around that monitoring. And not only do we have this list of activities, if you go over to the second monitoring section, this is almost like a quality control check that we've developed through the transition working group and the interagency phases diagram to make sure that that's all happening the way it should be. So what we do in the tutorials is to explain how these tabs fit within all of the different phases. And there is also more information within the phases of transition diagram tool itself that can give more of the background around that and how it's structured.
Thank you, Anna. That is very, very good to kind of get that clear, clarity around, and where should be like find some of this questions answered. And again, within the phases of transition, phase 3 has a lot more engagement with practitioners in terms of trainings and equipping them to have the resources they need. I think like phase 3 has a component, as you say, that is very in-depth in equipping practitioners to be ready for the transition. And again, if that's not really embraced within phase 1 and phase 2, you'll create a transition plan that's not necessarily inclusive of the very important aspects. So I think that is very important to know that, hey, as much as we want to transition and as much as we want to push for transition, are we mentally ready? Have we changed our perception in phase 1? And as we get to phase 3, we're kind of ready to kind of take up some of these things. So that is really helpful. question 5, can the tools be used by governments? I don't know, Rebecca, if you want to take this up.
Sure,
And
and Hannah,
anyone can answer that as well.
yeah, others might want to
Yeah.
jump in. The reality is that many of these tools reflect working with privately run facilities, mainly from the perspective of in contexts where transition or closure may still be voluntary. And so there may be government mandate to scale back the number of residential care services. There may even be law and policy that dictates closure processes under certain conditions, for example, abuse, exploitation, not failing to meet minimum standard, unregistered, but they may or may not be being implemented effectively in those contexts yet. So this reflects that type of environment where there's still a lot of voluntary decision making being made by the residential care services as to whether they transition or close or so forth. So both the, particularly the monitoring tool, and Hannah, you might speak to this more, a lot of what it draws out is trying to understand where there is that resistance happening that may be unspoken. Whereas if it was happening by government, so if government are involved, then typically what you'll see is a stronger enforcement of mandate, which means there's less room for private services to stall or to resist those changes because it's happening under mandate. So yes, governments could use it, but most likely what governments may want to do, and even if for yourselves as partners, is to adapt the tools, is to, there'll be components of it that are, as Hannah explained, very much about case management and social work processes that are going to happen in any facility, irrespective of whether it's voluntary or not. And so there might be components that'll be very, very useful, but you may want to adapt them so that those differences are better reflected and you're not, putting in front of government a tool that probably is more complicated than it needs to be, because for them, if they are involved, they've got a direct line of authority that tends to simplify the transition, closure, or divestment process. For the divestment resources, governments may want to use that in a way to encourage private donors, endorse and encourage private donors. What are they asking them to do? So it may be used in the context of statements. Some governments are now putting out statements demonstrating what they're asking, which is for donors to invest in family-based care, prevention of separation. They may choose to signpost resources to help private donors walk through that process in an ethical way. But it's probably more likely for a donor country's government to use these tools to work within their charity sector or something like that than it would be for an implementing country government to do that outside of simply referring to the tools. So the answer is yes, but most likely with some consideration and an adaptation of what's the right context.
Thank you very much. I think that that's a really good answer for the fact that what we see as government coming into and working together with government within building resources is that government with its mandate, as you said, Rebecca, to bring forth regulations can be guided in some way with how to build those regulations around how to take an organization through transition or what the timelines are. But I think, as you said, there has to be like a collaborative kind of friendly environment where institutions work with other non-state actors to kind of build together a tool, like a way to be able to use these tools in a practical way within a context. When I was in Uganda a few months ago and we're having a training on this transition tools, there was that, there were those conversations about, hey, how can we take this back home? How can we start using this? And it's like, well, what has already been done? And I'm really grateful for BCN and how these tools from the beginning have really informed Kenya as a country on how can we best build resources to help in the transition process. So I'm really grateful because this is a good platform foundation to kind of build within experiences and tools that we should probably be bringing back to kind of work together to say, hey, this has worked here, why? And how can we best use those experiences across the world? So thank you for that. We will go to the next question. And that is for you, Rebecca, again. And again, we can all chip in. How would the tool be useful for collecting data on transition more broadly?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's specific to the monitoring tool. One thing that the Transition Working Group is starting to discuss is developing more of a rigorous data and evidence agenda to wrap around that work, which we're now in a better position to do given the development of some of these consensus-based tools, the addition of this monitoring tool, which, as Hannah explained, has a number of purposes. But even if organizations are using it as work plans, the fact that it captures systematic data that is linked back to the phases of transition starts to actually gather evidence that can then start to really help us to understand trends better, help us to start to really refine what we understand as evidence-based good practice around this, particularly, noting how things work. So if in a transition phase, you're noting that there's been some stalling taking place and an organization takes specific measures to address that stalling, what do you see happen? Do you see it resolved? And that data, that evidence starts to then help us to understand, okay, here's some trends and patterns around how we address these pockets of resistance. I noticed that some participants posed questions about motivating. How do you motivate donors? How do you encourage social workers? How do you make this more practical or accessible to all practitioners, irrespective of levels of education and experience? This kind of tool kind of starts to really help us understand, dig into those things as we collectively use it. And if we're collectively willing to make those, de-identified data sets available, essentially, then as we've done with other aspects of work in the Transition Working Group, where we've collected a lot of case studies, and that's allowed us to then move to stage 2, which is analyzing those case studies, looking for the evidence, looking for the trends, and then developing that into practice frameworks. I think that this monitoring tool can do that as well. But because it captures data essentially as a byproduct, if as a community we can bring that together, then I think we can start to really dig in and analyze that and identify new trends that perhaps we weren't aware of, practices that we are seeing. There is evidence to say, when you see this happen, these are the types of steps that have corrected those stalls or backward movement, and we can therefore promote them with more confidence that they're rigorous. So I think that's an important next step, and I think it's a conversation we'll hopefully carry forward within the Transition Working Group. And we'd welcome everybody who's here today and may use these tools to participate in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As we're quickly wrapping up, there's one more question. This is for Rika. Is the Thriving Scale methodology from Miracle Foundation a public resource?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The Thrive Scale methodology is not a public resource, but it is very much, you can visit our website to have a glimpse of it. And if particularly you're interested in knowing more, we'll be happy to take you through the methodology. You can write to us, and also the technology counterpart of the same, the Thrivewell app. So we can take you through that. So we'd be happy to discuss in detail about that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to say that we're coming to the end of this webinar, and I always want to leave a webinar with a call to action. What are we saying is the next step for everyone? And I would obviously encourage all of us to take these resources and practically use them. Let's have discussions around the divestment, regulations, and what do they mean for you in your own experience. And then let's also work to practically use the tools so that we are able to see within the transition monitoring tool, what are the things that we can pick up from it and use, and then give feedback as well, so that we are continuously growing and improving these tools to be effective. So I would really encourage all of us as a call to action. Let's just take that up as we move on. Again, we have a platform that we can all access and be part of, the Transforming Children's Care Collaborative. Please join and be part of these conversations, be part of future webinars that will be very informative and really nourish and edify ourselves as we continue through this journey. So thank you all for being part of this. And we will be sending a link, of course, to the resources. So please look into the text and chats that we've had. You'll be able to see the resources, but of course, the webinar recording will also and slides will be shared over email. If you have any questions, please comment and recommendations for future webinars topics. Please send them to contact@transformcareforchildren.org. Thank you all for being here today, and God bless.